The morning the rain stopped, my daughter-in-law told everyone in the store that I was nothing more than a customer. I was sitting where I had sat for 30 years, on the low wooden stool behind the counter, the one with the seat worn smooth and shiny from decades of my weight settling onto it, morning after morning. The cash box sat open in front of me, the way it always did at 9 o'clock, and I was counting yesterday's receipts the way my husband had taught me to count them. Slow and careful, each bill turned the same direction before it went into the drawer. There were 6 or 7 customers in the store that morning. Old Mrs. Fuang from 2 doors down, buying nails for her grandson's chicken coop. The young couple, who'd just moved into the apartment above the noodle shop, picking through bags of cement. A delivery boy waiting on his motorbike outside. Engine still running, the smell of exhaust drifting in through the open door, and mixing with the smell of dust and metal that had lived in this building since before I was married. Nagok came down the narrow staircase from the office above, her heels striking each wooden step like small hammers. She was wearing a blouse the color of a ripe persimmon, bright and confident, and her hair had been done at the salon that morning, every strand in place. She crossed the floor without looking at any of the customers, walked straight to where I sat, and stopped. "Ko already too old to be counting anything," she said. Not quietly, not as if it were a private matter between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law that should stay inside the family, inside these 4 walls. She said it the way you announce a closing time, loud enough that Mrs. Fuang's hand froze halfway to the nail bin, loud enough that the young couple stopped whispering to each other. "The store is mine, and Dad's now, Ko. You can sit here if you want, like a customer. But please, don't touch the cash box anymore." The fan on the ceiling turned its slow, tired circle above us. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The delivery boy's motorbike idled on, oblivious. I did not answer her. I closed the cash box, gently, the way you close a door on a sleeping child so as not to wake them. I folded my hands in my lap, the same hands that had once balanced the books of this store against candlelight during the years after my husband's first heart attack, when the bank statements didn't make sense, and someone had to make them make sense. I looked at my daughter-in-law's face, flushed now, with the satisfaction of having said the thing she'd clearly rehearsed in her head, and I smiled. Just a small smile. The corner of my mouth lifting, nothing more. The kind of smile you give to a child who has just told you, very seriously, that the sky is green. Mrs. Fuang was staring at me, waiting for me to say something, to defend myself, to cry, to do anything that made sense to her. The young couple had gone very still, the way people do when they sense they've wandered into someone else's quarrel and don't know whether to leave or pretend they heard nothing. I said nothing at all. I rose from the stool, smoothed the front of my pants, and walked toward the back of the store, toward the narrow door that led to the storage room and, beyond it, to the small altar room where my husband's photograph watched over a thin coil of incense smoke that never quite went out. Behind me, I heard Ngok let out a small breath, almost a laugh, the sound of someone who believes she has won something. She had no idea what she had actually done. 3 months. That was how long it had taken to arrive at this morning. 3 months since my son Hoa had left for the construction site 11 hours north. 3 months of phone calls that grew shorter and further apart. 3 months of watching my daughter-in-law move through this store, the way water moves through a crack in a wall, slow and patient and certain, finding every weak place. I had seen this kind of patience before. Not from her. From the river behind our old house when I was a girl, the one that flooded a little more every rainy season, until one year it simply took the bottom field whole, and everyone acted surprised, though the water had been telling them for years. In the altar room, I struck a match and lit a fresh stick of incense beside the ones already burning down to ash. The smoke rose in a thin gray ribbon, bending once in the draft from the window, then climbing straight again. My husband's eyes looked out at me from the photograph the way they always did, steady, a little amused, as if he already knew something I hadn't told him yet. I knelt there a long moment, listening to the store sounds drift faintly through the wall. The register opening, Nok's voice rising in cheerful instruction to the delivery boy, The ordinary noise of a morning continuing, as though nothing at all had happened. Still water runs deepest, my mother used to say. Back when I was young enough to think it was just something old women said to make silence sound wise. I understood it differently now. The water that makes the most noise rushing over stones is rarely the water that does the damage. It is the water that says nothing, that simply waits, settling lower and lower, finding the one place where the foundation has already begun to give. I was that water now. I lit one more stick of incense, set it gently into the brass holder beside my husband's photograph, and let the smoke carry upward into the quiet. Let her think she had won the morning. I had 30 years of numbers in my hands, and somewhere in this house, folded inside a box I had not opened in a very long time, was a piece of paper that would tell her exactly how wrong she was. To understand why I said nothing that morning, you would have to understand what this store was before it belonged to anyone's argument. My husband Hoa and I opened it the year after our wedding, in a town where the road wasn't even paved yet, where the rains turned the path in front of our door to red mud every September. We had almost nothing, then a small loan from his cousin, a stack of borrowed shelving, and a single bare bulb hanging from a wire in the ceiling that we lit every morning at 5 and turned off every night past 9. I kept the books from the very beginning, even before anyone called it bookkeeping, even before I had a single proper ledger. In those first years, I wrote our sales in the back pages of an old-school notebook, the kind with the soft gray cover, because we couldn't afford anything better, and Hoa would lean over my shoulder at night, by the light of that same bare bulb and ask, "Tuyet, did we make anything today?" And I would run my finger down the column of numbers and tell him the truth, whatever it was, good or bad, because that was the agreement between us from the start. No pretending, no softening the numbers to spare each other's feelings. He used to say, I had a banker's hands and a poet's patience, which made no sense and made me laugh every time he said it, because I was not patient at all in those early years. I was frightened, the way every young wife with a new husband and an empty cash box is frightened. But I learned patience from the ledgers themselves. Numbers do not lie to comfort you. They simply wait until you are ready to see them clearly. I came to love that about them. We built the wooden counter ourselves, the one I would still be sitting behind 40 years later. We built the shelves. We chose where the light from the east window would fall in the afternoon, so customers could read the labels on the paint cans without squinting. Every decision in this store, down to the nail in the wall where we hung the calendar each January, was a decision the two of us made together, late at night, after the shop was closed and the street outside had gone quiet, except for the frogs in the rice paddies behind the house. Our son Koa was born in the small room above the store, the same room Enjok would later use as her office. I remember nursing him at 3 in the morning with the account book still open on the bed beside me, because the rice supplier was threatening to raise his prices and I needed to know, even half asleep, whether we could absorb it. Hoa used to tell people, only half joking, that I ran the numbers and he ran the smile, meaning he was the one who greeted customers, remembered their children's names, gave credit to the families who needed it during the lean months before harvest, while I sat quietly in the back, making sure that generosity didn't sink us. We balanced each other that way for almost 40 years. When his heart first failed him, the year Koa turned 12, it was the ledgers that kept the store alive, while he recovered months of careful counting, of saying no to suppliers who wanted payment up front, of finding, somewhere in the cracks between numbers, enough room to breathe. He recovered. We had 11 more years together after that. 11 years I have learned, since his death, not to take for granted even in memory. When Hoa married Ngok, 6 years ago, I welcomed her the way I would have welcomed any daughter into this house. She was clever. I noticed that immediately, the quickness in her eyes when she watched the register, the way she picked up the rhythm of the customers within weeks. I thought, in those early months, that perhaps she and I would come to share the same quiet partnership Hoa and I once had. I taught her how to read the supplier invoices. I showed her where I kept the spare key to the storage room. I told her, more than once, stories about how her father-in-law and I had built this place from a borrowed shelf and a bare bulb. I did not yet understand that, for some people, knowing where something came from only teaches them where to find its weak points. Hoa died 3 years ago, in the spring, on a morning when the lychee trees behind the house were just beginning to flower. I lit incense for him every day after that without fail, in the small room we had always meant to use as a proper altar room and finally did, once there was someone there to honor. Hoa took over the daily running of the store. With my blessing he had grown up between these shelves, the same as I had grown old behind them, and Ngok, capable and quick as ever, became his partner in the work the way I had once been Hoa's. I stepped back. Gladly, at first. I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with my legs or my back. I let myself believe that stepping back simply meant resting, that the store would carry on the way Hoa and I had built it to carry on, steady under new hands. I did not yet understand that there is a difference between a daughter-in-law who inherits your trust and one who is simply waiting for you to look away. The first time Njok moved against me, she did it so gently I almost thanked her for it. It was nearly a year ago now, not long after Koa first left for the construction project up north 11 hours by bus, 6 months at a stretch, sometimes longer if the contractor needed him for the next phase. He called every few days at first, his voice thin and far away over a bad signal, asking how the store was doing, whether him being gone was too much of a burden on us. "Don't worry." Nok would say into the phone, loud enough for me to hear from across the room, her voice bright with reassurance. "Me and I manage everything together. You focus on your work." It sounded, in those early weeks, exactly like the partnership I had once hoped for. The change began with small things. A Tuesday afternoon, slow with customers, when Gok suggested kindly, she made sure it sounded kind, that perhaps I should let her handle the supplier calls from now on, since her Vietnamese was, she said with a little laugh, more modern, better suited to negotiating with the younger men who ran the delivery trucks these days. I agreed. It seemed reasonable enough. My hearing wasn't what it used to be on the phone, and the supplier conversations had grown longer and more complicated since the new highway brought in cheaper materials from the city. A few weeks after that, she moved the account ledgers from the drawer beneath the counter, where they had lived my entire married life, up to the office above the store, the room that had once been my bedroom with Hoa, and then briefly the nursery, and was now hers. "Easier for me to update them digitally," she explained, showing me the laptop she'd bought, its screen glowing blue in the dim light of what used to be our window. "You don't need to carry that old notebook around anymore, Ko. I'll keep everything organized now." I let her have the ledgers. I told myself it was simply the next generation finding its own way of doing things, the way every generation does, the way I myself had once moved on from candlelight bookkeeping to a proper electric lamp, and felt very modern doing it. It was the third change that made something in my chest go quiet and watchful. The way it used to go quiet when Hoa's breathing changed in his sleep, and I would lie awake listening, unable to say exactly what had alarmed me, only certain that something had. A man named Dat began appearing at the store. Nok introduced him as a business associate, someone with capital who could help expand the shop. We could add a second location, Ko, near the new market. Dat has the connections. He was younger than Koa, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted that a room would arrange itself around him. He had a habit of walking the length of the store, with his hands clasped behind his back, the way an inspector walks a building he is already imagining torn down and rebuilt to his own design, measuring the shelves with his eyes, running a finger along the counter. Hoa and I had built with our own hands 40 years ago, leaving a faint smear in the dust that I wiped away myself. That night, alone, after everyone had gone home, I asked Ngok, once, gently, what exactly Dat's role was, what papers he had signed, what he had put in, and what he expected to take out. She laughed, not unkindly, but in the particular way people laugh when they want a question to seem smaller than it is. "Don't worry about the business side, Ko. That's not really your concern anymore. Is it? You should rest. Spend more time at the altar for Bo. We'll handle the rest." I noticed She had started calling Hoa simply Bo now, as if claiming a closer right to his memory than I held myself. And I noticed, too, the small redirection in her words. Your concern anymore, spoken so lightly, like a curtain drawn closed over a window. I had looked out of my entire adult life. That night, I sat alone in the altar room long after the incense had burned down to its last gray inch. I did not light another stick. I simply sat in the dark beside my husband's photograph, listening to the wind move through the gap under the storage room door. A low, steady sound, like breath. You always said I worried too much over small things. I whispered to the photograph. Tell me now, am I worrying over nothing? Or is the water already rising? The photograph, of course, gave me no answer. Hoa's eyes simply looked back at me, calm and slightly amused, the way they always had, even when the bank statements made no sense, even when the rice supplier threatened to ruin us. I have come to believe, since his death, that this expression of his was never really amusement at all. It was patience. The particular patience of someone who trusted that I would work it out, given time. I decided, that night, that I would work it out. I did not confront Ngok. I did not ask Dat to explain his measuring eyes or his careful hands along the counter. I simply began, very quietly, to watch. And 3 days later, going into the storage room to find a spare ledger of my own, an old habit, Noak didn't know I'd never fully given up, I found the first thing that told me I was not worrying over nothing at all. The storage room smelled the way it had always smelled in the rainy season, damp concrete, cardboard gone soft at the corners. The faint mineral tang of nails and hinges stacked in open bins along the back wall. I had come in for nothing more than a roll of packing tape, the kind we kept on the third shelf for sealing the rice sacks before delivery, and I might never have seen the folder at all if the tape hadn't been moved. It wasn't on the third shelf anymore. It had been pushed onto the second, behind a stack of cement bags, the way you hide something not because you think no one will look there, but because you've stopped believing anyone still looks at all. I had to move 2 bags to reach it, and beneath them, tucked between an old invoice box and the wall, sat a thin blue folder I had never seen before. Ordinary, the kind sold at any stationery stall in the market. The kind of folder that holds nothing more interesting than school papers or tax receipts. I should have left it. Some part of me, the part that had spent 68 years learning not to go looking for trouble, told me to take my tape and go back to the counter and forget I had ever pushed those cement bags aside. But my hands were already opening it. Inside were perhaps a dozen pages, and I recognized the format before I understood the content. The particular gray-bordered template of the business registration office, the kind of form I had filled out myself decades ago, when Hoa and I first registered this store as a household business, back when the office still used carbon paper, and the clerk's hands were always stained blue at the fingertips. Transfer of business ownership. I read the heading twice, certain my eyes were tired, certain the dim bulb in the storage room was playing some trick with the print. But the words held their shape. Beneath the heading, a name I knew, Dang Min Hoa, my son listed as the current registered proprietor, the position Hoa had held until his death, and that Hoa had taken over after, with my full blessing, in the proper way, at the proper office, with my signature as witness on the original transfer. And beside his name, in the space marked for the incoming party, another name. Not Ngok's. Ching Kwok Dat. My hands had gone strange and distant, the way hands go in cold weather, though the storage room was warm and close with the smell of rain trapped under the tin roof. I turned the page. There was a section requiring the signature of the proprietor's spouse or co-owner of record, a formality I knew from my own years of paperwork, required whenever a family business changed hands, to confirm that everyone with a legitimate claim to the property had consented. The line was there. The space for that signature. It was blank. Not unsigned in the ordinary sense, the way a form sits waiting on a desk for someone to come collect it. Blank in a way that felt deliberate. The way a held breath feels different from simply not breathing, as though the form had been prepared in every other detail, every box checked, every figure entered with the careful, confident handwriting I had come to recognize as Ngok's, and only that one line left empty for someone to fill in later. Left empty, I understood with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, for someone to be persuaded to fill in. I sat down on an overturned crate among the cement bags, the blue folder open across my knees, and listened to the rain begin again on the tin roof above me, soft at first, then steady, then loud enough to drown out the ordinary sounds of the store on the other side of the wall. Nuso's voice, cheerful and unhurried, helping a customer choose between two brands of paint, as if nothing in this building were about to change at all. I thought of the storage room as I had first seen it 45 years ago, half-built, smelling of fresh-cut wood instead of damp cardboard, Hoa standing in the doorway with sawdust in his hair, telling me, "This will hold everything we need it to hold. Tie it. You'll see." He had never imagined, I was certain, that one day it would hold this. I closed the folder slowly, the way you close a door you don't want to make a sound, and slid it back exactly where I had found it, between the invoice box and the wall, behind the cement bags, in the place where someone had decided no one would ever think to look again. Then I went back to the counter, picked up my roll of tape, and returned to sealing the rice sacks, as though my hands had not just learned something they could not unlearn. But that night, kneeling before my husband's photograph with a fresh stick of incense burning low and steady in the brass holder, I found myself thinking not of the blank signature line, not even of my son's name beside a stranger's. I found myself thinking of the old wooden box on the highest shelf of the altar, the one I had not opened in over a decade, the one that held, somewhere beneath Hoa's reading glasses and his army discharge papers, and a photograph of the two of us standing in front of this very store. The year it opened, a single folded document I had nearly forgotten still existed. A document with a date on it, far older than anything in that blue folder. A document no one else in this house even knew I still had. I waited 3 days before I opened the wooden box, because some part of me already understood that once I knew what was inside it, I would not be able to go back to simply watching. The box itself was nothing remarkable: pale lacquered wood, a brass clasp gone slightly green with age, sitting on the highest shelf of the altar, beside a small porcelain incense holder Hoa's mother had given us as a wedding gift. I had to drag the wooden stool from the storage room to reach it, and even standing on my toes, my fingers only just closed around its edges. It was lighter than I remembered. Grief has a way of making the objects connected to it feel heavier in memory than they actually are. I brought it down to the low table in the altar room and sat with it for a long while before I opened it. The way you sit with a letter you suspect contains bad news, turning it over without reading it, as if delay alone might change the contents. Inside, just as I remembered, Hoa's reading glasses, the left arm still slightly bent from the time he'd sat on them at a wedding banquet 30 years ago. His army discharge papers, yellowed and soft at the folds. A handful of old photographs, the two of us standing in front of the store, on opening day, both of us absurdly young, Hoa's hair still black, my own waist still narrow enough that I could remember exactly which dye I'd been wearing, though the photograph itself had faded to sepia. And beneath all of it, wrapped in a square of plain cloth that had once been part of an old curtain, a single folded document, its creases gone soft and pale from age. I unfolded it carefully, the paper nearly translucent at the fold lines, the way old paper becomes when it has been opened and closed too many times by hands that were afraid of losing it. It was the original minutes from the founding council, meeting the gathering of local officials and neighborhood elders, that had formally registered our household business all those decades ago, back when such registrations still required a council session rather than a single form stamped at a counter. I remembered that meeting the way you remember the most important afternoons of your life. The small administrative office, with its single ceiling fan, the council chairman's careful handwriting, Hoa sitting beside me, in his only good shirt, both of us trying not to look as nervous as we felt. The document listed us both Dang Van Hoa, and Luong Thi Tuyet, joint founders, co-owners of record. Not Hoa alone, the way later forms would simplify it for convenience, the way Hoa's registration decades later had listed only his father's name, because by then it was assumed wrongly, as it turned out, that a wife's name was simply folded into her husband's. This document, the oldest one, the true one, named us both, with the chairman's signature and seal still legible at the bottom, and beneath it, in smaller print, the clause every founding document of that era carried: ownership and rights of disposition to remain joint and undivided between named parties and their lawful heirs, transferable only, with the written consent of all living co-owners of record. I read that final line 3 times. All living co-owners of record. I was still a living co-owner of record. Whatever COA's later registration said, whatever blue folder NGOC and DAT had hidden behind the cement bags, this older document, this true foundation, beneath all the paperwork that had been built on top of it over the years, had never been undone. No one had ever formally removed my name. No one, in nearly 50 years, had ever thought it necessary to ask. My hands were shaking now, not with fear, but with something closer to the feeling of standing on solid ground after believing for days that you were sinking. I thought of the rice paddies behind my childhood home, the way the elders used to say that a house built on a borrowed foundation will always belong, in the end, to whoever holds the deed to the land beneath it, no matter how many walls you raise, no matter how confidently you hang your own door. Ngok and Dat had been building their transfer on top of COA's registration. Certain that was the only foundation that existed, they did not know there was an older one beneath it. A foundation I alone still held the paper for. I sat in the altar room a long time after that, the document spread flat across my knees, the incense burning low beside Hoa's photograph, and for the first time since that morning, Nok had called me nothing more than a customer in my own store. I felt something other than watchfulness move through my chest. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and more dangerous than triumph. Certainty. I refolded the document along its old, soft creases, more gently now, the way you fold something you understand you will need again very soon. I did not return it to the box. I wrapped it instead in a fresh square of cloth and placed it inside the lining of my own handbag, the worn canvas one I carried with me every day, the one no one in this house had ever once thought to look inside, because no one had ever imagined that an old woman's handbag could hold anything more important than spare change and a folded handkerchief. Outside, the rain had started again, drumming softly against the tin roof of the storage room, the same steady rhythm it had kept for 3 days now. Somewhere beyond the wall, I could hear Ngok's voice on the phone, not the customer voice, brighter and more careless than that, the voice she used only with Dat. Just need Hoa to sign when he's back for Tet, she was saying, the words drifting faintly through the wall between us. After that, it's done. Completely done. I sat very still, the old document warm against my side, where it rested in the lining of my bag, and listened to my daughter-in-law plan. The final piece of something she did not yet understand was already standing on ground that was no longer hers to build on. I did not say a word about what I'd found. Not to Ngok, not to the neighbors, not even, in the days that followed, to my husband's photograph during my evening incense, though I sat with him longer than usual each night, as if the silence between us had become its own kind of conversation. Instead, I began to watch more carefully than I had ever watched anything in my life. There is a particular satisfaction in counting numbers that someone else believes you can no longer read. I had spent 40 years balancing books by candlelight and by the dim glow of that first bare bulb, and whatever Nok thought my eyes and my mind had lost to age, they had not lost the habit of noticing what didn't add up. I started, very quietly, paying attention to things I had let drift past me. For months, the gaps between deliveries that didn't match what was logged, the new supplier trucks that came twice a week now instead of once, unloading crates I didn't recognize from companies I'd never heard Hoa or Koa mention in all our years of business. On a Thursday afternoon, while Joke was at the market and Dad had gone into town on his motorbike. I let myself into the office upstairs, my old bedroom, then briefly the nursery, now hers, using the spare key I had shown her myself all those years ago, never imagining she would one day need reminding that I knew it existed. The laptop sat closed on the desk, and I did not touch it. I have never claimed to understand those machines, and I was not foolish enough to think I could outsmart whatever password protected it. But beside the laptop, in a drawer that stuck slightly the way it always had even when it was my own drawer, I found a stack of printed papers, invoices, supplier agreements, a half-finished loan application. From the agricultural bank in town, Dad's name, listed as primary applicant. The store itself, listed as collateral. I read every page standing up, my heart beating with a kind of quiet, careful excitement I hadn't felt since the early years with Hoa, when finding a mistake in a supplier's invoice meant the difference between profit and loss for the whole month. There is a particular thrill, I have learned, in being underestimated. People who believe you can no longer see clearly will leave their papers in unlocked drawers. They will speak freely on the phone in rooms they think are empty. They will measure your silence as surrender, never once considering that silence might simply be patience wearing a different coat. I photocopied nothing. I did not yet trust myself with the small machine at the print shop down the road. And besides, I had something better than copies. I had memory, sharpened by decades of holding entire columns of figures in my head before I ever wrote them down. I memorized names. Dad's full name as it appeared on the loan application, his identification number, the bank branch listed, the amount requested 800 million dong, against a property that was not yet legally his to offer as collateral. That evening, after the store closed and Gok had gone upstairs to make her phone calls, I walked the 2 streets to Pete's. No, not Pete. I corrected myself, smiling faintly at my own mind, wandering toward a story that wasn't mine. I walked instead to old Mr. Tho's house, 2 streets over, the retired district clerk who had worked in the very registration office where Hoa and I had first filed our papers all those decades ago, back when he was young, and the carbon paper still stained his fingers blue. Mr. Tho was 81 now, mostly deaf in his left ear, but his memory for old paperwork was, if anything, sharper than mine. He poured me tea on his porch, the steam curling up between us in the cooling evening air, and listened without interrupting while I described what I had found careful, even now, not to say too much, the way you test the depth of a river before deciding whether to wade in. That clause, he said finally, tapping one knuckle against his knee, joint and undivided, transferable only with written consent of all living co-owners. That was standard language for every household registration before the reforms. I drafted 100 documents with that exact wording myself. He looked at me over the rim of his teacup, his eyes suddenly very alert despite his age. Too yet. If you still hold the original with that clause, and no later document carries your signature releasing your share, then, legally speaking, nothing your son's wife is planning can stand. Not without your name on it. I sat with that on his porch, a long moment, listening to the frogs starting up in the rice paddies behind his house, the same sound I had fallen asleep to as a young bride 45 years ago. They believe the water has already gone where they pushed it, I said quietly, almost to myself. Mr. Tho smiled, the particular smile of an old man who has spent his whole life watching paperwork outlast the people who tried to bend it. Water always remembers its original course, too yet. Sooner or later, it finds its way back. I thanked him and walked home in the deepening blue of early evening, my handbag close against my side, the old document still wrapped safely in its lining, and for the first time in many weeks, I let myself feel something close to amusement at how confidently my daughter-in-law had been building her plans on a foundation she did not know I still controlled. I did not yet know how much further she and Dat were willing to go to make sure I never found out in time. By the time the lychee trees began to bud the same season, 3 years earlier, that had taken Hoa from me, Nok had stopped pretending altogether. It happened gradually enough that I could mark the stages, the way I once marked the months of a pregnancy, each one a little further along than the last. First, she stopped asking me to mind the register even occasionally. The small courtesy she'd kept up in the early weeks after that first cruel morning, as if to prove to the neighbors that nothing had really changed between us. Then she stopped greeting me when she came down the stairs in the morning, her heels striking the wooden steps the way they always had, her eyes moving past me as though I were simply another fixture of the store, like the ceiling fan or the calendar nailed to the wall. The final stage arrived on a Sunday, when Dat brought a contractor to walk through the building with a tape measure and a clipboard, the two of them speaking in low, business-like voices about after the renovation. And once the second location opens, as if I weren't sitting 3 meters away on the stool that had been mine for 30 years. Sorting receipts, I no longer had any official authority to sort. "We're thinking of moving the altar room," Dat said to the contractor, not lowering his voice at all, gesturing with his clipboard toward the narrow door at the back, where Hoa's photograph watched over its quiet coil of incense smoke. "It takes up valuable floor space we could use for storage. Maybe just keep a small shelf somewhere instead." Something in my chest went very cold and very still, the way a pond goes still just before the first frost of winter. The surface calm while underneath, everything is beginning to harden. I said nothing. I had learned, by then, exactly how much my silence could hold. That evening, Ngok called Hoa while I was lighting the evening incense, and though she kept her voice low, the walls of this old building had never been built for privacy, only for shelter from the rain. I heard enough. "Just sign, when you're home for Tet, N. It's just a formality, really, to bring in more capital for the second store. Dat's already found the location near the new market." A pause. Then her voice softening into the particular tone she used when she wanted something badly enough to make it sound effortless. "Your mother doesn't need to be involved in the business side anymore. She's tired, Ong. Let her rest. We'll take good care of everything." I knelt very still before my husband's photograph, the smoke from the incense bending once in the evening draft before rising straight again, and I listened to my daughter-in-law describe my own retirement to my son, as though it were a mercy she was granting me, rather than a door she had been quietly closing for months. 2 days later, Dad had papers printed, proper printed forms this time, not handwritten drafts hidden in a blue folder behind cement bags, but official-looking documents, with the registration office's letterhead reproduced at the top, the kind designed to look authoritative enough that no one would think to question them too closely. He left a copy on the counter that morning, almost carelessly, as though he no longer felt any need to hide anything from me at all. I picked it up and read it standing at the counter, in full view of whoever might walk in. A consent form. My consent form, this time not blank, the way the earlier draft had left that line waiting, but already filled in. My name typed neatly in the space for the co-owner's signature, with only a small empty line beneath it, where an actual signature would need to go. Dat watched me read it from across the room, his expression unhurried, almost kind, the expression of a man who believes he has already won, and is simply waiting, out of politeness, for the other party to acknowledge it. "We thought it would be easier this way, Co," he said. "Save you the trouble of going to the office yourself. All it needs is your signature, and the second location can move forward. Ho is already agreed, in principle. We just need everyone formally on the same page." I set the paper down on the counter, smoothed it flat with one hand, the way I used to smooth ledger pages before closing them at the end of a long day. I looked at Dat, for a long moment, at his confident posture, his clipboard tucked under one arm, his certainty that an old woman with a banker's hands and a poet's patience could simply be handed a form and trusted to sign whatever was placed in front of her. "I'll think about it," I said. 4 words. The first words I had spoken directly to him in nearly 2 months. Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, that I had spoken at all, or perhaps simply satisfaction that the water, as he understood it, had finally agreed to flow exactly where he had been pushing it for months. I folded the consent form carefully and slipped it into my handbag. Beside the older document, it would never be able to override. and walked back toward the altar room, where Hoa's photograph waited in its patient, knowing silence. That night, for the first time since I'd found the blue folder behind the cement bags, I did not sleep at all. I lay awake, listening to the rain start against the tin roof, thinking not of the consent form sitting folded in my bag, but of the moving boxes Dad had mentioned to the contractor, the small shelf he imagined replacing my husband's altar. They believed they had already won everything that mattered. They had no idea what they were about to lose. The truth came to me on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered not by Ngok or Dat, but by my own son's voice over a phone line 11 hours away, and it broke something in me more thoroughly than anything Njok had said to me, in front of strangers that first cruel morning. Koa called, while I was alone in the store. Ngok and Dat, both out meeting the contractor at the proposed second location. His voice sounded tired the way it always did after a long shift, but there was something else beneath the tiredness that afternoon. Something hesitant, almost guilty. "Ma," he said, "NGOC told me you already agreed to the transfer, that you signed the consent form last week." I stood very still behind the counter, the receiver pressed to my ear, the fan turning its slow circle overhead. "I never signed anything, Khan," I said quietly. A long silence on the line, filled only with the static hum of distance. She showed me a photo of the form. "Ma, your name was on it. She said you told her it was fine, that you wanted to step back from the business completely, that you said you trusted us to handle everything." I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the months I had not been paying close enough attention. Somewhere between the blue folder and the printed consent form, left so carelessly on the counter, my daughter-in-law had stopped simply planning to ask for my signature and had instead decided to manufacture my agreement entirely. Words I had never spoken, attributed to me with the same casual confidence she'd once used to dismiss me in front of customers. "Khan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I need you to come home. Not for Tet. Now. Ma, the project, Koa." I had not raised my voice to my son since he was a teenager, arguing about staying out past curfew. I did not raise it now, but something in the way I said his name made him stop. "Your father built this store with his own hands. I have something to show you that I should have shown you years ago, and I am asking you, as your mother, to trust me one more time before you sign anything at all." He came home 4 days later, 2 weeks earlier than planned, his face thinner than I remembered, sunburned along the back of his neck from months of outdoor work. I met him not in the store, where Ngok might overhear, but in the altar room, the door closed, the incense burning low and steady beside his father's photograph. I told him everything. The morning Nok had called me nothing more than a customer in front of Mrs. Fuang and the young couple from upstairs, the blue folder hidden behind the cement bags, his own name listed as the proprietor, transferring ownership to a man he barely knew, the loan application using the store as collateral, before any transfer had even been completed. And finally, the consent form with my typed name and his wife's casual, devastating lie that I had agreed to all of it. I watched my son's face change as I spoke disbelief first, the particular disbelief of someone who has built his understanding of his own marriage on a foundation he never thought to question, and then something harder, colder, the same coldness I had felt myself the night Dad spoke of moving his father's altar to make room for storage. "She told you I'd already agreed," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "She told me you'd already agreed. She told both of us the other one had already said yes." "Yes," I said simply. He sat very still for a long moment, his eyes moving to his father's photograph, to the thin ribbon of incense smoke bending once and then rising straight again, the way it had bent and risen every evening for 3 years now, patient and steady, through everything this house had endured. "Ma," he said finally, his voice rough, "show me the document. The old one, the one from the founding meeting." I reached into my handbag and drew out the folded paper, soft at its creases from decades of careful keeping, and laid it flat on the low table between us. Hoa read it slowly, the way I had read it myself that first night in the altar room, his lips moving slightly over the old formal language, the chairman's faded signature, the clause that had quietly outlasted every newer document built carelessly on top of it. When he looked up at me, his eyes were wet, and for a moment I saw not my grown son, weathered by years of hard work and a marriage built on assumptions, but the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder while I checked the day's receipts by lamplight, trusting completely that whatever I was counting it to keep us safe. She lied to both of us, he said. For months. Yes, I said again, and this time my own voice broke, just slightly, on the single word, not for myself, not for the cruelty of that first morning, or the casual contempt of a clipboard gesturing toward his father's altar, but for the quiet, specific grief of watching my son understand, all at once, exactly how thoroughly he had been deceived by someone he had trusted with his whole heart. We sat together in the altar room a long while after that, neither of us speaking, the incense burning down slowly between us, the rain beginning again softly against the tin roof outside. "What do we do now, Ma?" Hoa asked finally. I folded the old document carefully and held it against my chest for a moment, the way you hold something you have protected for a very long time and are finally about to set free. "Now," I said, "we stop watching, and we let the council read it for themselves." We did not move quickly, and we did not move loudly. After everything Noak and Dad had built on assumptions and unsigned lines and lies told to people who trusted each other, I was not about to hand them the satisfaction of watching me lose my composure now. Koa, to his credit, understood this instinct better than I expected. The boy who had once argued with me about curfews had grown into a man capable of sitting on his own fury long enough to use it properly, and over the next several days, the two of us moved through the quiet, careful work of preparing the ground beneath our feet before anyone else realized the foundation had shifted. We went together to see Mr. Tho first, the retired clerk whose porch tea I had shared weeks earlier. He read the founding document again in Koa's presence, slower this time, explaining each clause the way a teacher explains an old lesson to a student, finally ready to understand it. He agreed, without hesitation, to provide a formal letter confirming the document's authenticity and the legal weight of its language. A letter, he said, that the district registration office would have no choice but to take seriously, given his decades of service there and his own signature on file, from the original era of such documents. From there, we visited the registration office itself, not to confront anyone, not yet, but simply to file a formal request for review, a quiet, procedural step that asked nothing more than for the office to examine the chain of ownership before approving any pending transfer. I sat beside Koa at the counter while he filled out the paperwork, his handwriting careful and deliberate, nothing like the rushed signature Njok had hoped he would scrawl onto a form built on a lie. The clerk who took our request was young, perhaps 30, and looked at the old founding document with the particular curiosity of someone encountering a piece of history rather than ordinary paperwork. "This predates the current registration system entirely," she said, almost to herself, turning the page carefully. "We'll need to schedule a formal verification hearing. Both registered owners and any parties with a competing claim should be present. A hearing, not a confrontation in my own storage room, not a private argument behind a closed office door upstairs, but a formal proceeding in a government building in front of officials whose job it was to read documents exactly as they were written, without sentiment, without persuasion, without the particular charm Dad had used so effectively on everyone who had never bothered to ask him for proof. We scheduled it for the following week. In the days before the hearing, I returned to my old habits without announcement or apology. I sat once again on the wooden stool behind the counter each morning, the cash box open in front of me, counting the receipts slowly and carefully the way Hoa had taught me, the way I had done for 30 years before anyone decided I was too old to be trusted with numbers. Noak said nothing to stop me this time. Perhaps she sensed, in some instinctive way she couldn't yet name, that the ground beneath her plans had grown less solid than she'd believed. Perhaps she simply assumed my return to the stool was nothing more than an old woman's stubbornness, easily managed once the transfer was finalized. I let her believe whatever was easiest. Each evening, I lit incense for Hoa as I always had, but I found myself lingering longer than usual before his photograph, telling him quietly about Mr. Tho's letter, about the clerk's careful reading of the old document, about Hoa's steady hands filling out the request for review. I told him I understood now what he must have felt. All those years ago, sitting beside me with the first ledger spread between us, waiting patiently for the numbers to reveal what they were always going to reveal eventually, whether anyone wanted to see it or not. A house built on a borrowed foundation, my mother used to say, will always belong, in the end, to whoever holds the deed to the land beneath it. I understood now that the same was true of trust, of family, of every quiet assumption people make about who controls a story and who simply sits within it, watching. Noak and Dot had built an entire structure on the assumption that an old woman's silence meant surrender, that a blank signature line could simply be filled in with confidence, and a typed name, that the past could be quietly buried behind cement bags in a storage room no one thought to search. They had built it on sand, and they did not yet know the tide had already turned. 3 days before the hearing, Dat arrived at the store with new contractors again, clipboard in hand, walking the floor with the same unhurried confidence he always carried, gesturing toward the altar room, as though it were already as good as cleared away. I watched him from my stool behind the counter, my hands folded calmly in my lap, the cash box closed and quiet in front of me. He had no idea, as he measured walls that would never be his to knock down, that in 4 days' time, every official document he had built his confidence on would be laid beside one, far older, far simpler, and far more binding than anything in his blue folder, and that the storm he had spent months pretending didn't exist was no longer gathering somewhere out at sea. It had already reached the shore. The hearing room at the district office was smaller than I remembered from the few times I'd sat in rooms like it decades earlier. Just a long table, and a row of folding chairs beneath a ceiling fan that turned at the same tired pace as every fan in every government building I had ever known. But on that Thursday morning, it felt large enough to hold everything that had been building quietly for months. I arrived early with Hoa, both of us dressed carefully, the way you dress for a funeral or a wedding, something that matters. I wore the dark blue ao dye I had not worn since Hoa's memorial service, my hair pinned the same way it had been pinned every day for 30 years, nothing about my appearance announcing that anything unusual was about to happen. My handbag sat in my lap, the old document resting safely inside its lining, and I kept both hands folded over it the entire time we waited. Noak and Dat arrived 10 minutes later, clearly expecting nothing more than a brief procedural formality. Dat carried his clipboard out of habit, though there was nothing left to measure in a room with nothing but a table and chairs. Ngok wore the same persimmon-colored blouse she'd worn that first cruel morning, and when she saw me sitting calmly beside Hoa, her expression flickered with the particular irritation of someone encountering an obstacle they had already mentally filed away as resolved. "Ma," she said, settling into her chair across the table. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us. This is really just a formality. We could have spared you the trip." I said nothing. I had learned, by now, exactly how much weight my silence could carry. The clerk, who had taken our request the week before, opened the proceeding with the flat, careful tone of someone reading from a script she had read many times before confirming names, confirming the property in question, confirming the pending transfer request submitted by Mr. Trin Kwok Dat, with supporting documentation from Mrs. Pham Bichnok. Beside her sat an older official I didn't recognize, introduced as the district registration supervisor, a man with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and the unhurried patience of someone who had seen every kind of family dispute pass across his desk. "We also have a competing filing," the clerk continued, "submitted by Mrs. Luong Thi Tuyet and Mr. Dong Min Hoa, requesting formal verification of ownership prior to any transfer approval." Noak's eyes moved to me for the first time since she'd sat down, something sharpening behind her composed expression. "Mrs. Luong," the supervisor said, looking at me over his glasses. "You've submitted a document for review. Would you like to present it?" I opened my handbag. My hands, I noticed with some distant satisfaction, did not shake at all. I withdrew the old document, unfolded it with the same careful patience I had used the night I first found it in the wooden box, and laid it flat on the table where everyone could see it. "This is the original minutes from the founding council meeting that registered this business," I said, my voice steady, carrying easily in the small room without needing to be raised. "It lists 2 co-owners, my late husband, Dang Van Hoa, and myself." The supervisor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, reading the document with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who recognized its age before he'd finished the first line. Beside him, the clerk had gone very still. "This predates the simplified registration system entirely," the supervisor said, almost to himself, the way Mr. Tho had said the same words, weeks earlier. "The language here is standard for the period joint and undivided ownership, transferable only with written consent of all living co-owners of record." He looked up, first at the document, then at me, then, finally, at Dat and Njoke across the table. "Mrs. Luong is listed by name as a co-owner. Her consent would be required for any transfer of this property to proceed, regardless of what later registrations may state." Dat's confident posture had gone rigid. "That document is decades old," he said quickly. "Surely it's been superseded by the current registration, which lists Mr. Dang Min Hoa as sole proprietor." "Superseded would require a formal release of co-ownership," the supervisor said evenly, "signed by Mrs. Luong herself, filed with this office. Do you have such a document?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had heard in months. I watched Njoke's face during that silence, watched the particular flush rise along her jaw, the same flush she'd worn the morning she told me, in front of customers, that I was nothing more than a customer in my own store. I thought of that morning now, of the fan turning slowly above us, of Mrs. Fwang's hand frozen over the nail bin, of my own small, unreadable smile. "You're just a customer here now, Co," she had told me, loud enough for everyone to hear. I looked at her now, across the formal table, in front of officials whose job was to read documents exactly as they were written. "I have never been a customer in this store," I said quietly, "not for one single day in nearly 50 years. I built it. I kept its books for 30 of those years with my own hands. And my name has been on its foundation since before either of you were born." Ngok opened her mouth to respond, and found nothing to say. Dat recovered first, leaning forward with the same unhurried confidence he'd carried through every room he'd walked into since the day I first met him. "Even if Mrs. Luong's name appears on an old document, surely the intent of the family was for the business to pass to the son. We have a consent form prepared, ready for her signature, formalizing exactly that. I never signed it," I said. "And I never spoke the words written on it. My daughter-in-law told my son I had already agreed. She told me he had already agreed. Neither of those things was true." The supervisor's eyes moved to Ngok, sharp now, in a way they hadn't been a moment before. "Is this accurate, Mrs. Pham?" I watched my daughter-in-law search for an answer in a room with no folder to hide it in, no cement bags to push it behind, no carelessly left form that anyone could simply walk past without reading. For the first time since the rain had started falling on this story, the silence in the room belonged entirely to her. Whatever Ngok had planned to say in her own defense, Dat's voice arrived first, and it was his words, more than mine, that finally brought the entire structure down around them both. "This is absurd," he said, his composure slipping into something sharper, more impatient. "We've invested real capital into expanding this business. I have a loan agreement pending with the Agricultural Bank, using this property as collateral. We can't simply unwind months of work because of one old piece of paper." The supervisor's expression changed at the word collateral, the way a face changes when a casual remark accidentally reveals something far more serious than the speaker intended. You've already listed this property as collateral for a loan, he repeated slowly, before any transfer of ownership had been formally approved. Dat hesitated. The first hesitation I had seen from him. In all the months since he'd first walked through this store, measuring its walls with his eyes. The application is pending. Nothing's been finalized. Using property you don't yet legally control as collateral for a loan application, the supervisor said, setting down his pen with deliberate care, is itself a serious matter, regardless of how this ownership question resolves. He turned to the clerk beside him. Please make a note. This will need to be flagged for the bank's compliance office as well. Nuke's eyes flicked toward Dat with something I hadn't seen from her before. Not affection, not partnership, but the particular alarm of someone realizing, in real time, that the person she had trusted to manage the difficult parts had managed them carelessly enough to leave a trail leading directly back to both of them. Dat, you said the loan paperwork was just a formality, she said. Her voice lower now, meant for him alone, though the small room carried every word to everyone present. You said it wouldn't matter until everything was finalized. It doesn't matter, he said quickly, though his confidence had visibly thinned. We'll withdraw the application. It's a simple fix. It is not a simple fix, the supervisor said. Misrepresenting collateral on a pending loan application is a matter this office is required to report, separate from the ownership question before us today. He looked between them both, his patience visibly narrowing. I would also like clarification on the consent form previously submitted, listing Mrs. Luong's name with her purported agreement. Who prepared that document? Another silence. Longer this time. I prepared it, Ngok said finally, her voice tight. But I had every reason to believe Ko would have agreed if she'd simply understood the benefits of the expansion. I was trying to make things easier for everyone. Easier, I said, the word leaving me quietly, without anger, though I felt something settle into place inside my chest as I said it. You told my son I had already agreed. You told me he had already agreed. You prepared a form with my name, typed onto it, and left only a line for a signature you assumed I would eventually provide, once I had no other choice. I looked at her then, fully, the way I had not allowed myself to look at her in months, not as my son's wife, not as the daughter I had once hoped to share a quiet partnership with, but simply as someone who had mistaken an old woman's patience for an empty room. You called me a customer in my own store, I said. In front of Mrs. Fwang. In front of strangers. I said nothing that morning. And you believed my silence meant I had nothing left to say. I was not staying silent, because I had nothing to say. NGOC. I was staying silent because I was still counting. That is what I have always done, since before you were born. I count quietly, and I wait until the numbers are ready to speak for themselves. Koa, beside me, had not said a word through the entire proceeding, his jaw tight, his hands flat on the table in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. I want it formally noted, he said, that I withdraw my prior registration as sole proprietor, pending full review of co-ownership, and that I support my mother's claim entirely. He looked at Ngok, not unkindly, but without the softness I had heard in his voice on the phone weeks earlier. You told me she had agreed to all of this. I believed you because I trusted you. I won't make that mistake again. The supervisor closed the folder in front of him with a quiet, final motion. Given the verified founding document and the absence of any valid consent from Mrs. Luong, this office will not approve the proposed transfer of ownership. The matter of the loan application and the prepared consent form will be referred separately for further review. He looked at Dot, then at Nok, his tone entirely without sympathy now. I would strongly advise you both to seek legal counsel before this office's findings are finalized. Dat stood first, his clipboard forgotten on the table, his composure finally, completely gone. He looked at Ngok with something close to accusation, as if her carelessness, rather than his own, had brought down everything he'd spent months building. You said this would be simple, he muttered. You said the loan was nothing to worry about, she snapped back. And in that single exchange, in front of officials and clerks, and the two of us who had been the actual target of their plans. I watched the partnership between them crack open entirely, each one already reaching to set the blame on the other. They left the room separately, not even walking out together, and I sat very still in my chair, the old document once again folded safely in my hands, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading down the corridor in two different directions. Hoa exhaled slowly beside me, the breath of someone setting down a weight he had been carrying for months, without realizing how heavy it had grown. "It's over, Ma," he said quietly. I looked down at the document in my lap, at Hoa's name beside my own, ink faded but still legible after all these years. "No," I said gently. "It's only just been put back where it belongs. The store looks much the same now as it did before any of this began, though I notice the small differences more than anyone else might the slightly worn place on the counter where Dad used to rest his clipboard, now bare again. The corner, near the storage room, where a stack of cement bags once hid a folder I was never meant to find. Noak and Dat are gone. Not punished beyond what their own carelessness had already arranged for them, the loan application withdrawn before it could become a formal violation, the registration office's findings quietly closing the door on any future transfer, Hoa's marriage ending not in court, but in a conversation I was not present for, and never asked about, out of respect for whatever grief still belonged only to my son. I did not ask for any of it. I asked only for the truth to be read plainly, by people whose job was to read it without sentiment, and once that truth was read, the rest unfolded, the way water always finds its way back to its original course, without my needing to push it there myself. I am not richer than I was before any of this began. The store's value has not changed. There was no settlement, no payment extracted, no number added to any ledger I keep. What I have instead is simpler than money, and I have come to believe it is worth more. I sit again on the wooden stool behind the counter every morning, the cash box open in front of me at 9 o'clock, counting the previous day's receipts slowly and carefully, each bill turned the same direction before it goes into the drawer, exactly the way Hoa taught me almost 50 years ago. Mrs. Fuang still comes in for nails and hinges, and she greets me now with a small nod that says more than words could, an acknowledgement between two old women of something that needed no further explanation. Hoa has stayed on as proprietor, but the registration now lists both our names, the way Hoa's and mine once did, all those decades ago, before either of us had any idea how long this small piece of paper would need to keep its promise. We sat together at the district office to file it properly, and when the clerk asked whether I wanted my name listed first or second, Hoa answered before I could. "Hers first," he said. It was always hers first. In the evenings, I still light incense for Hoa in the altar room, that no one will ever move again, the brass holder catching the last light through the window the way it always has, the smoke bending once in the evening draft, before rising straight and steady toward the ceiling. I tell him, most nights, some small piece of the day, a customer who reminded him of someone, a number in the ledger that finally balanced after weeks of confusion, the particular quiet satisfaction of watching the store breathe the same rhythm it breathed when the two of us first built it from a borrowed shelf and a single bare bulb. I think often of something my mother used to say, back when I was a girl too young to understand it as anything more than an old woman's habit of speech. "Still, water runs deepest," she would tell me, watching the river behind our house rise a little more each rainy season, patient and unhurried, until one year, it simply took back what had never truly belonged to anyone standing on its banks. I understand it fully now, in a way I could not have understood it as a young bride, counting our first sales in the back pages of a school notebook. The loudest water rushing over stones rarely does the real work. It is the water that says nothing, that waits, that settles low and steady, until the moment the ground beneath someone else's confidence finally gives way. I was that water for nearly a year, sitting quietly behind a counter I was told no longer belonged to me, counting in silence. What others assumed, I could no longer count at all. They believed my stillness meant I had already lost. They never once considered that I might simply be waiting for the numbers to speak for themselves, the way they always eventually do, if you are patient enough, and have kept the right paper folded carefully enough, for long enough, close enough to your heart. I close the cash box gently each evening now, the way you close a door on a sleeping child, and I walk back toward the altar room where my husband's photograph still watches over everything we built together, steady and a little amused, exactly the way it always has. Still, water runs deepest. I tell him quietly, settling the incense into its holder. I think, after all these years, you finally understand why I never once doubted it. If you are an older parent who has ever been talked over in your own home, dismissed as someone who no longer understands, or quietly pushed aside by the very people you raised, please know this. Your patience is not weakness. The quiet years you spent watching, listening, and holding everything together were never wasted, and they are not finished yet. If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe so more stories like Tuyet's can find their way to you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close to you, and if so, how did you finally prove them wrong? Let us know in the comments below.